everyone. Thank you for joining us. Some of you especially, I know you're remote, but we're happy not to miss you tonight. We'll go over the agenda just briefly, and one of our physical quorum counts will be delayed, so we'll just hold off a little bit. We're only doing one investigation review tonight. That's an error on the memo, on the agenda, my fault. But welcome. Thank you, everyone, joining us online also. I'll take quick attendance, and then we'll do some updates and introductions. Commissioner Montgomery? Here. Commissioner Shawkin? Here. Commissioner McCullough will be here hopefully soon. Commissioner Smith? I'm here. Commissioner Dean is not with us yet.
He'll be joining personally.
Yeah. Commissioner Miller's absent. Commissioner Ortiz? Here. Commissioner Evans, great. So our biggest chair update, which is very exciting, is that Selena was approved by the board, I think last night. And so she'll start the onboarding process and join us very soon. So happy to not just have another person, but such a good person. So we've been queuing around Selena for a little while and happy that it finally got through the board, and would love to let you introduce yourself and tell us kind of about your interest in community oversight and, you know, what you do in your free time.
Thank you. It's really nice to meet you all, and very excited to be here. It's been a few months in the making, so it's exciting that it happened. My name is Selena Shawkin, and by way of background, I have graduate degrees in law, public policy, and business. I have mostly been working in international public health, so I have my own small consulting firm, and I mostly work on women's health in developing countries. So prior to the pandemic, I was sort of on the road all the time in various countries. And then during the pandemic, sort of slowed down and realized that I was spending way too much time traveling and in other countries and didn't know enough about the community where I was living. And that is a lot of my motivation to be here. And so I actually moved from Washington, D.C. to Arlington during the pandemic. And I live in Westover, sort of near the Virginia Hospital Center. And really what I'm excited about is sort of being a part of the community and getting to know how Arlington functions and how we can work together to make it function even better. And I really have a sense that things are going well, and we have to find ways of building trust for the whole community and having people feel like they're included and welcome and part of the community. In my free time, I have a rescue dog, spend a lot of time with her. And also this year I've been getting into gardening and enjoying my new house in Westover. So,
oh, wonderful. What are you gardening right now?
A combination of, I've been planting like hydrangeas and various things with mixed success, and also planting vegetables. So my tomatoes are doing great, my carrots are not. But I'm enjoying the process of learning about it.
Oh, good. Yeah, it's nice to be outside and get to be in the real world, separate from all the process. But to your point, I think we've made a lot of progress, building a process in this space. Still, some moving pieces, and continuing to work with ACPD on how we keep things moving, which is, part of our target right now is clearing out, what we have queued for 2023. And I think next week we'll do at the next meeting, not next week, 2 weeks from now, I think it's June 12th, that we'll do 2 investigations. And I think that wraps what we have access to right now. So there's a couple more in the queue from 2023, and then we've got to get kind of into the next phase. So
are we doing 2 meetings in June?
I'm hoping that we don't need to.
Okay, because I'm trying to figure, I know I have to do an investigation, I'm trying to figure out what date by what date I need to get that done, but we don't have to talk about that.
Yeah, I would like to do both next meeting, because one of them is like almost ready to go. Just like with the long weekend and people's schedules, it was kind of rushed, and we've all agreed that it's better not to come into these discussions without like a little bit of an even keel. So yeah, I don't see any obstacles to that right now, and if we can get those scheduled, that'll be good. But
so welcome, Selena. Yeah.
And we have Gary online. Gary, we have a new member, which is very exciting. You'll have to meet her in person next time, but thank you for joining us online. I know participating in double the meetings has been a little bit cumbersome, but I think we might get to a place where we can try to more efficiently get 2 done per meeting, and that would be a better approach than what we have now, which just feels kind of like rapid cycling. So I'm torn a little bit whether to go over some of the initial information without Charles.
We do meeting minutes.
Oh, yeah, we can do meeting
That'll
minutes.
kill 2
There we go,
minutes.
we'll bump it up. Thank you. Excellent suggestion. And then Mummy, if you have any updates, we could bump you up too, but if you're not, if you don't, that's also fine. And then everyone can tell us about their exciting summer plans. You're going on travel, where are you headed?
I will be in Mexico.
Oh,
Yeah.
Very nice.
Yeah, first time.
Wait,
Oh,
did you say
really?
New or old Mexico?
I don't know what is considered new and.
No, the
No,
New
like the
Mexico
New
State.
Mexico-
Oh, the state or the country?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
There are.
I will be going to the country.
Okay.
Where are you going?
Cancun.
Oh, wonderful.
Ah,
It's confusing because like in Puerto Vallarta, there is Viejo Vallarta, which is like Old Vallarta. So, you
Yeah.
know, all
Yeah.
these places. How long will New York be New York? There's not a, I guess there is a York, but it's not here.
There is.
So
There is a York.
there is a York, yes. There might even be more than one,
There, I'm sure there are.
but only one new one.
That's right.
I'm pulling.
There's a lot of Arlingtons.
Yeah, Arlington, Texas.
That's the only one I'm aware of.
Yeah, every time I Google Arlington, I have to make sure it's not Texas.
Yeah.
So that's the one that comes up first.
It's funny that you mentioned that. We often still do get complaints on officers
Oh, really?
that are officers in Arlington, Texas.
Seriously?
Happens all the time. Yes, yes.
Wow.
And then we were trying to figure it out. We're like, oh, this name doesn't sound familiar. It's like, that doesn't sound like a vehicle number. And then, it's like, well, let's check and make sure that he's got the right Arlington. So, yeah.
Yeah, well,
Usually it's Arlington, Texas.
there's a whole information desk at the Austrian airport for people who accidentally booked a trip to Austria instead of Australia.
Get out.
Get on
Oh,
the
God. Oh, God.
Yeah.
It's like, wow, this is a short flight.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's the international version of, I think there's like a lot of social media content about like when you show up at the wrong Dulles or Reagan
Oh, yeah.
and they like mock you for being in the wrong place. It's like, I don't know, life's complicated, there's a lot to keep track of.
Actually, I did that once.
Oh, did you?
I did that once, yeah. I was supposed to be going out of Dulles. Don't ask me how I thought I was going out of Reagan.
Oh,
And I was like, oops.
ouch.
I made it though.
Oh, wow, look at
That's
you.
impressive.
I never leave early enough that I would.
Yeah,
be able to hear
I
words.
did. I did leave early enough.
When I travel with people, I'm willing to give a buffer, but when I travel alone, I'm like, what are you gonna do if you're there early? Buy candy? Like, no,
Yeah, yeah.
those are the only options, right?
That would be so stressful for me.
And it was one
I'm
of those,
working
because I
on
was supposed to be meeting somebody, and I'm like, I'm standing at the whatever, American Express desk, and he said, so am I. And I'm like, no, you're not. And I'm like, where are you? And I'm like, oops.
That happened to my parents at JFK
Oh.
when we lived in New York.
Oh, and
We
with
were at-
LaGuardia? With
My-
LaGuardia and JFK? Did they get confused? Is that where they were going?
Yeah, it was LaGuardia, and my dad was picking her up at the wrong airport.
Oh.
And it was long before Uber, so it was like long way to come around. Okay. Meeting minutes, I'll just do a quick scan. I didn't see any errors. We'll just quality check while we're here. Cool,
I'll move that caption so it's on the same page.
that's fine.
This is actually the old version.
Version control is my most difficult job. Perfect. Oh, right, that was 2 cases. Okay. Hi,
Oh, sure.
your timing is impeccable. We need you to approve the meeting minutes.
Those minutes?
I know.
Does it matter?
No.
Okay.
Sit up there, please. Okay, do I hear a motion to approve the meeting minutes?
I moved to approve.
Second?
Second.
All in favor, aye?
Aye.
Aye.
Charles? Meeting minutes?
Yes.
Stellar. Any abstentions?
As you were posting.
Gary, did I hear your vote? Sorry.
Thank you for that. Perfect.
All right. I think-
Yes, I said a hearty aye.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, stellar. Meeting minutes done. Mummy, if you want to queue and do any updates now, you're welcome to, but if you want, we can wait and come back to it. But we can
Nothing
get
on my
started.
end.
Sorry?
Nothing on my end.
Wonderful. Well, we knocked out the agenda backwards, but we're doing well. Okay, so this case originated from a complainant sent to ACPD alleging that officers failed to investigate an incident, used excessive force in detaining him, and failed to identify themselves when he requested their badge numbers. Police were responding to a call at a local restaurant. An allegation of assault and battery with mention of a knife. 6 officers arrived on the scene and, kind of straddled talking to the reporting party and the complainant. Oh, so sorry. Yes. Gosh, everything's out of order today. Tuesday was Monday. I'm doing it inside out and backwards. So the dispatch information was that a white female was assaulted by the complainant with a report that he pulled a knife on her. Officers then responding to the scene because of a report of somebody with a weapon, immediately detained the complainant and said he was being detained for disorderly conduct, read his Miranda rights. He explained that as he was exiting the bathroom, the reporting party blocked his exit in an attempt to hold the bathroom door open, and that he told officers that he moved her arm so he could exit the bathroom, and that he had a plastic knife in his hand. So in the interaction with the complainant and the officers that were inside, the complainant requested that they call for a supervisor and provide their badge numbers. Initially, I think Officer 1 said they would do both later, but then the complainant reiterated his request for a supervisor to Officer 3, who asked why and said, when you give us the information for our report. But Officer 4 obtained the complainant's information while Officer 3 did step outside to request a supervisor. And then Officer 4 provided the complainant with badge numbers on the back of his business card. So outside, 2 officers, Officers 3 and 4, took the lead, kind of getting information from the reporting party. She said she was waiting outside the bathroom with a door code that the restaurant had given her that didn't work on one of the 2 bathroom doors, so she was waiting for the other one to be free. And so she said she, corroborated the same kind of information. She reached out to hold the door before the complainant, and the complainant said, "Why are you getting this close to me?" And she told officers that, she said, "I'm so sorry, I'm trying to use the bathroom," but the complainant grabbed her arm, and she noticed that he appeared to be holding something sharp. Reported initially as a knife, but in her account to officers on camera said it could have been something else. I don't want to claim that it was a knife or anything. It could very well have been a plastic utensil. So she reported that he spoke very sternly to her. She could see why he was being a little defensive around the bathroom. She said she apologized again, said she was trying to use the bathroom. Officer 4 asked her if she felt scared or threatened, and the reporting party said a little bit, but nothing to the extent that it was overwhelming. She said no multiple times when they asked if she wanted to go to the magistrate to press charges. Meanwhile, the other officers were kind of, reviewing evidence possibly in and around the bathrooms and talking to witnesses who saw the altercation but said they weren't sure that they saw him grab her. So she was very much in distress when she came back. They called the police. Officer 4 relayed to Officer 1 that she did not want to press charges and that the plastic knife likely corroborated her description of something sharp. One of the officers also noted in going in and out of the bathroom that maybe she saw the door handle, which kind of a little bit maybe immaterial. So the involved officers conferred amongst themselves that were on scene already, deciding that the matter was a 304, an incident that could be resolved with a report only and no arrest. Officer 1 told the reporting party outside that the complainant would not be arrested, but that he would request a supervisor kind of explaining why they were still hanging around and excused her from the scene after collecting her information. The complainant was told at least twice, I think on body-worn camera footage, that he was not going to be prosecuted. Officer 2 asked Officer 5 if the complainant could be charged with disorderly, and Officer 5 replied definitely not, as they didn't witness anything disorderly. So Officer 5 later informed some of the officers that he recognized the complaint. And about 20 minutes into the complainant being detained, Officer 5 asked the 2 officers that originally kind of interacted with him if they had pat him down, and said that they'd done a sweep but not a pat down. So Officer 5 informed the officers they had reasonable suspicion to do a pat down, and instructed them to perform a pat down prior to removing him from handcuffs. So Officer 1 began the pat down, and the complainant requested that Officer 1 put on gloves and did so after the other officers responded that he needed to. So he continued the pat down and discovered a small folding knife in the complainant's pocket. The complainant also had with him at the table where he was sitting a long kind of metal bar. And so they, took the knife off of the complainant's person, and the supervising officer arrived on scene a few minutes later, about 26 minutes into the call. He spoke with the complainant to get kind of the information from the complainant directly and get his complaint. And they had an interaction where the supervising officer was explaining that, you should be able to resolve these things with your words. You shouldn't need to put your hands on someone. The complainant stepped forward towards the reporting officer and said, something to the effect of, like, you don't want me this close to you. And the reporting officer or the supervising officer, put his hand on him to push him away. And he said, as an officer interacting with somebody in handcuffs, I absolutely do not want you that close to me. And the complainant turned around to demonstrate he was in handcuffs and said, how am I going to hurt you right now? So the supervising officer, after kind of wrapping up with the complainant, came back to talk to the other officers on the scene and asked why they were called. Officer 2 described that the complainant had a plastic knife in his hand, a metal knife, which Officer 2 indicated may be a misdemeanor, and noted that the reporting party did not want to press charges. Officer 2 stated that she was, quote, fine getting him off the street, and the supervising officer replied, I don't think we have to do that, but based on coming here and taking these actions that we took. Then the supervising officer suggests that they mute their body-worn camera footage, which they all know is for private conversation. So that discussion was not captured on audio, but before muting her camera, Officer 2 remarked, I didn't think we were allowed to do that anymore. So after that conversation, ultimately the officers changed their initial assessment and decided to arrest the complainant for violating Virginia Code 18.2-57 for assault and battery. After nearly an hour, the complainant was taken out of handcuffs and released on his own recognizance to appear in court at a later date. As a result of the complaint, OPR conducted an investigation of the incident and potential policy violations for personal contacts, identification as a police employee, preliminary and follow-up investigation, duty responsibilities, and use of force. So in general, reviewing the officer interviews, their account of the events corroborate what was on body-worn camera footage. But the supervising officer stated he did not specifically recall the discussion that took place when the body-worn camera feeds were muted, but stated it's his practice to adhere to responding officers' recommended action as long as it's within reason. So looking through the kind of footage and going through the relevant policies, personal contacts, identification, it didn't seem like the officers were rude or, disruptive. They did identify themselves as required under the identification policy. One of the complaints that was made was that they didn't follow up with reporting making a false report, and that the information given by the reporting party and witnesses kind of corroborated her input. So, and then, use of force. So we have the description of duty responsibilities and use of force that, there didn't seem to be an indication that, he was aggressively handled or improperly handled in the initial detention. So for our discussion, I think the things that stuck out to us in investigating was the potential violation of the body worn camera policy at the time. And then absent that information, understanding why there was this decision to arrest, grabbing another person under these circumstances, it did seem like, especially with the interaction with the supervising officer, that, if someone's blocking your exit to a bathroom where it's kind of sensitive and personal space, that, it wasn't an overtly violent gesture. And that, her kind of being unsure what he had in his hand made it seem like he wasn't wielding it in a violent way, whatever he had in his hand, presumably the plastic knife. And so I think then the last element from our review was just that, was it on, for a few of the policy violations, personal contacts and use of force, and then exclusively for the supervising officer on preliminary follow-up investigations, there were certain officers that were not interviewed as part of the investigation. One of them has since left the ACPD force, but the others that there was a recommendation from the OIPA that all officers be interviewed to kind of provide the relevant context and information. So I'll stop there and see if any of the COB have questions.
Sure. I have a few process and protocol questions that kind of dovetail to what you were saying, but of the ones that I had, you've actually covered some of them.
Okay.
And I think those ones are on my list are
Yeah.
higher priority. So in the interest of time, maybe you take those and then I kind of point out things that I think, the questions I have.
Okay.
Is that, it's up to you.
Why don't you outline your questions and then
Okay.
we can hear from Mummy and Albert.
So again, most of them, just like you pointed out, were more of the process and protocol variety because the nature of this. The last thing you mentioned was, how we determined who was interviewed. So one that I have with regard to the report itself and investigation is, and this is something I just didn't notice in any of the other summaries that OPR provided to the chief, but near the end of this one, there was just a little paragraph that talked about the legal outcome of this particular person. I just don't recall seeing that before, and I was just kind of inquiring as to the relevance of that, considering we're looking at the actions of the officers, and I didn't. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. Go on.
So my question is, the relevance of that to the actions of these officers.
I just want to note
Yes.
that it noted in the OPR report that he was found guilty
Correct.
in court, but in his circuit appeal, he was found not guilty by a jury.
Right, and that's why I'm asking that question, that regardless, that to me, regardless, seems a bit prejudicial because it doesn't necessarily go to the actions of the officers per se. It's just, and again, maybe that's something that's always in there, I just didn't notice, because we don't see a lot of, we don't see, there's more that's done, out there, we don't see that, so I just want to questions about that. And the next ones are just about the process of the process and protocol for the incident. I know that this particular person raised some issues during their pat down regarding the use or not use of gloves. This person seemed, the interaction seemed also cased in a sensitivity to, we're all still, even some of us still wearing masks here, and COVID is not long gone, despite it not being in the news or anything else like that. So just kind of what those policies are when it comes to pat down. This one, I know in an earlier case, we also had questions about the timing of it. So I'm just trying to understand, are there any standard protocols that we as a board should kind of be looking out for to see, well, was this pat down done timely? Was this pat down done with the right procedures? The next thing would be the requesting of the supervisor. That's again something that comes up a lot in the cases that we look, and just to understand what, if any, formal policy is there? Is there a look towards perhaps developing one if one isn't there? Because we see that a lot in the cases that we review. And then the last two would be the protocol for officers to when it comes to just the numbers and again, this is something we haven't discussed this one for a while, but one of our earlier cases, we were talking about, well, why do we have 6 folks around? Because, as the chief has pointed out, we do have an issue with, our force not being as robust as we want. So by my count, the body worn cameras, which I saw at least went out to 55 minutes, and there's sometimes before and after. So that's 55 minutes of 6 officers on this case, which was largely contained within definitely within that first 25 minutes, but even more than largely contained. And then the last thing, and it's small, but it does keep coming up, and it's regarding officer identification. This time it came up with regard to cards. And again, I just noticed that, they didn't all have the cards. They had to, write something down. I'm just thinking just for the officers themselves, it would just be so much easier. So is it a supply thing? Is that something we can do more? But then I'm also thinking of other times when we think about the ways we identify officers, the particular units they're driving in, and the inability of some of the public to readily identify the number on the car. Or names on the badges. That's something that, or not on the badge, but the name on the uniform, not being able to necessarily see that nameplate. So just generally speaking, what this case really kind of brought up, what can we do to provide officers the necessary tools, make sure they replenish, they can easily identify themselves, but also things we can do so the public can easily see the officers that they're dealing with. And that's not just for issues that come before us, but just general like safety issues, just general, being able to identify an officer. I could imagine many situations where just for officer safety, you want to be able to identify, oh, that was car 64 there, that was car 20 there, or just, be able to see everybody on the scene. So those are them. Again, it's a lot of little things, but I guess because because this one went so, 55 minutes, you just jogged my memory on a lot of little protocol and process things.
Yeah, go ahead.
And I'm glad you brought the amount of officers, because this has been and I don't know if it's just a policy or a cultural thing, but having so many officers to this particular incident when they could be utilized somewhere else, and also it's an intimidation factor of you're in a restaurant, an establishment, and disagreement occurred. 6 officers shows up as if you was robbing the place. So maybe we can, stress to the, I don't know if it's culture, policy, appropriate response when it comes to, especially when the first 2 officers walk in and realize what's going on and everything's contained. You don't need 4 additional officers to come in. Well, I don't know, just as a member of the public, it feels excessive.
Yeah.
Excessive. Yes, it feels that way. So if I can feel that way, and usually things rolls off me like whatever. But for certain other people, it can be very intimidating, and it creates a barrier between the police officers and the citizens, and that's what we're trying to avoid, especially as the COB. We're trying to bring the community together, hence the name Community Oversight Board. So that's just my opinion on that.
Yeah, I think in my head that's kind of linked to the element of like the body worn camera recording violation is that it's very unclear how this went from a situation that sounds like a kind of minor altercation where the complainant says no to being asked if she wants to press charges or go to the magistrate, and then it seems like through her interview the incident kind of got smaller and smaller in her mind.
Right.
And so we just don't have the information to understand how they went from telling him he wasn't going to be charged to deciding to arrest him, which to your point about the number of resources, it's like all of this for, I mean.
And it includes in that almost 3 minutes of silence, and what the public may not know is that, this isn't something that happened yesterday. So we're asked, so even though when we interview when the officer interviewed, they are able to refresh the recollection of the body worn camera, well, it was silent, during that part. So those that we were able to, those that OPR and OIPA were able to talk to, there were differing recollections of what led and who led to that a decision to arrest them, but the information was in that silence that unfortunately we don't have.
Yeah.
And I don't know why it just bothers me that so many officers get. I'm trying to get over it, but utilizing the public resources such as public officers in a healthy and respectful manner as far as all these extra cops at the scene, they could have been somewhere else assisting another, a real situation, well, not real, but, another citizen.
More material
More
threat.
material, right. So is that, I think that will fall under duty and responsibilities and excessive or use of force. Just something noted, just like, please let's utilize our resources effectively. That, I don't know why that bothers me so much about all these officers and standing around. You see them on the body camera, you're like, you're just standing there. Like,
Well, it's three things. Have a shortage of staffing.
Exactly.
We have a disproportionate response and the kind of like intimidation of the situation seemed like it was in hand pretty immediately, right? Like they weren't responding to a live altercation that needed to be contained. And while, that many officers reporting initially, might make sense because there's, a report of a knife in a public place, which is a very understandable threat to investigate that like sticking around for that long. And to your point, maybe, it's partly protocol that it's like who started doing what when. But Lisa, do you have anything to add, Dave?
No, I mean, those are good questions.
Okay. Mami, is there anything you want to add?
Yes, thank you. Appreciate the discussion. Can you all hear me okay?
A little bit. You're a little soft.
A little soft.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. Let me know if at any point you all don't hear me well. I apologize for being virtual and off camera and traveling at the Police Executive Research Forum conference for the next couple of days. So sorry to not be there in person. And also, hi, Selena. It's really nice to have you on board with us. Are you all still not hearing me?
We're just turning up
It's
the
a little
volume.
hard.
I'm trying to fix the volume from this.
Okay. Okay. Is that better?
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
that's
better,
better.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, great. I was on my my AirPods and I just use the phone regularly. So I was just saying, sorry that I couldn't be there in person. I'm at the Police Executive Research Forum conference this week. And I just wanted to formally say hi and welcome on board to Selena. Sorry I wasn't there to greet you in person, but I definitely look forward to working with you and we're really happy to have you on board. As far as the investigation goes, I definitely want to start with just underscoring that, the perspective that I think many of you have shared, and what I also share about the resources spent on the investigation or on the investigation of the underlying incident and how it was resolved, is not meant in any way, shape, or form to undervalue how important it is to take seriously and dedicate resources and respond to any acts of violence, not just against women, but of anyone. And so, I definitely am happy that this was taken seriously by our officers and that they responded to the call. I think like the key point, because obviously when they went to the scene, they thought that this was a brandishing of a knife, not a plastic knife, but an actual an actual weapon. And so it makes sense to me why several officers reported to the scene. It makes sense to me why the complainant was immediately detained. But once they discovered that the situation was not what was, initially reported, my expectation would be that some of those officers start to then leave the scene and go back in service. And so I think that I just wanted to underscore that because I don't want it to sound as though we are underplaying what the reporting party's experience may have been. I think, when you look at the situation holistically and you are able to hear both sides of the story, we're able to see something that the reporting party may not have seen, which was why the complainant, acted in the way that he did to kind of move her out of his personal space. And that makes sense. But I think, that was information that she didn't necessarily have, or that the people that made the call on her behalf didn't have at first. But all that being said, I think actually the officers that responded, in both talking to him as well as the reporting party, did a great job in trying to get to the bottom of what took place. And they were actually trying to distill the situation or de-escalate the situation and get to the root of what should happen. And ultimately, they reached a result that they were not going to prosecute. And the complainant was told multiple times that he was not going to be prosecuted. And the reporting party also said that she did not want him to get in trouble or for her to pursue the matter further. What I think my biggest issue with this investigation that that happened around that happened within the first 10 minutes of the call. The complainant asked to speak with a supervisor around 9 or so minutes into the call. And then it goes essentially downhill from there. And policing is first and foremost, a public safety a lens there, or it's a public safety job, but it's also a customer service job. And so when we think about, equitable policing for all people involved in the situation, especially one that is like relatively less serious than, other situations that may arise, um, it should not be the case that when a supervisor is called to the scene, that the situation actually escalates or results in a worse outcome than what would have happened. Because had the complainant not asked for a supervisor at that kind of 9-minute mark, I have no reason to think that he wouldn't have just been free to go, uncuffed and free to go. But instead, what happened was because he asked for a supervisor, he was in handcuffs for about 50 minutes and then walked away with assault and battery charges. Obviously, circumstances, hypothetically can change, but factually, no circumstances change between the time that he asked for a supervisor and the end of the call for service. That's where I kind of have, I think that's for me like the meat of where my concerns are with this incident. And I'm going to start from kind of like a macro level. So when we're talking about this, asking for a supervisor, and I've been trying to see like where there is actual written directive or policy, and I'm not sure that one necessarily exists. But please correct me if I'm wrong, Captain Kim or Chief Penn. But I think if there is not a clear policy around how a protocol should go when someone is asking for a supervisor, so I'm starting just from like the basics of, a supervisor coming to the scene. When a complainant asks to speak with a supervisor, that experience should not then result in having to kind of negotiate with the officer that may possibly be the subject of the complaint that you're wishing to file. So ideally, and especially in this situation, we had not one, not two, but like 5 other officers or 4 other officers, I think at the time, on the scene who could have stepped in and kind of had a conversation. Now in this situation, I think it was Officer 5 that stepped in to have the conversation. So this dynamic, what I'm talking about here, was able to take place because of the number of officers. But something I'm kind of seeing, and again, I'm talking macro, so not necessarily fact specific to this investigation, but when a complainant asks to speak with a supervisor, ideally the person that that should help to effectuate that process should not be the officer who they may be wishing to file a complaint against. I've also seen in complaints or in body-worn camera footage where officers are telling complainants that they're not really required to, call a supervisor, and then asking why, which asking why makes sense because obviously when you call a supervisor, you will need to tell the supervisor why they're being called to the scene. But I think we'd also, be remiss if we didn't acknowledge that if you are asking someone why, and they're seeking to perhaps file a complaint that's against you, and you're already in a position of authority over them as an officer, that could create more of an intimidating dynamic. And then especially when you say things like, oh, I'm not really required to, or if you do this, then I'll call the supervisor. Not all of those factors were, present necessarily in this case, but certainly there was, why are you calling for a supervisor? And I just laying that foundation because I think now there's been a couple of different instances that I've seen where it's clear that there probably should be some sort of more I guess, sterile, if you will, for lack of a better word, way to get a supervisor to the scene, and then for them to be able to follow up with the complainant if they, for resource purposes or what have you, are not able to report to the scene. But it should not be the officer is the potential subject of the complaint's decision whether or not to call a supervisor. Just like if you go into any other, location or, business, place of business, and you ask for a supervisor, you're not expecting to have to negotiate with that employee whether or not a supervisor is called to the scene. So then fast forward, the supervisor comes to the scene. During that period, I did also notice that no pat down was ever done of the complainant. I wanted to point that out just from an officer safety perspective, which is that, again, had he not even called a supervisor, he would have been gone. And the whole reason why all these officers are on the scene and the way he was detained the way he was because of potential allegation for a knife. So just from an officer safety perspective, that pat down should have happened a lot earlier. And the reason why I loop it into this conversation is because I'm just trying to draw out the theme of, from a complainant's perspective, how it can seem that because of the fact that I've asked for a supervisor, now I'm being detained longer, now I'm being searched, now I'm being charged. This can seem like a punitive experience because you asked for a supervisor. And that's certainly not the kind of dynamic that we want to have if we're talking about building, trusting and transparent and accountable relationships. Um, so then, as far as this is macro, right? So now we're talking about this specific investigation. I exonerated all of the allegations except for duties and responsibilities, which if I had more evidence, I may have sustained, but I did not sustain. And the reason why is because I think the key information is what happens when the body worn camera footage is muted. The issue I have, again, this theme of a supervisor comes to the scene, we're expecting the situation to get better and not worse, but it seems like it was escalated. The concern I have is with the supervisor going into the conversation with the other officers and saying something to the effect of, well, since it had to come to the scene, I don't know what the rest of that sentence was or what happened during that conversation. But I certainly would not. I hope it is not the case that because a supervisor comes to the scene that then someone has to be charged if that's not the equitable outcome. But because we don't know, and that's where I think the fairness of the duties and responsibilities come in. Was it fair for him to be charged with assault and battery based on the facts and circumstances that were presented? I can't say for sure because we weren't privy to the conversation. I do actually agree, Julie, that based even on the previous body worn camera policy, that there would have been enough to sustain, because it wasn't even within policy from the previous policy. But going back to kind of the previous investigation that we looked at, I think systemically we realized that the way that the policy was being practiced was that officers thought that they could go mute their cameras when they wanted to engage in these kind of like internal huddles. And so that policy has since been cleared up. But at the time this investigation happened, it was in between the implementation of the new policy, which I think was officially implemented a couple months later. So it sounded like, especially based on the other officers' comments, that she thought that they weren't supposed to do that, that, potentially that training had already started to trickle down perhaps. But it definitely, it wasn't an allegation that we formally pursued. And I think it's definitely worth drawing out the point, especially here, because it was the key kind of crux of when the situation took a turn, in a different direction. And also because the previous policy, as well as I believe the current policy, makes a specific, it gives a specific duty to supervisors to ensure that officers are following the mandates of body worn camera footage. And in this situation, the supervisor completely misguided the officers on what to do in that situation. But going back to the policy itself, I just didn't necessarily feel that it was necessarily equitable to pursue an allegation if the underlying issue of the guidance on how to how to follow the body worn camera policy properly has already been addressed on a department level. But I would certainly make the recommendation that the supervisory role in ensuring that those duties are followed should be underscored. And so if that was a policy that we had pursued in this particular investigation, I think the culpability or like the level of responsibility would have been on the supervisor who instructed them to mute their body worn cameras. I think those were all of the kind of points. Oh, the one last thing I wanted to say was that I agree, Charles, that I did not concur with the relevance of the legal outcome in this situation as a justification for exonerating the officers on duties and responsibilities. I certainly agree that, you know, we can't speculate as to what happened here. So I don't know that we necessarily would have, I don't think that we have enough professionally to sustain. But to exonerate the allegations that the officers may not have exercised their authorities fairly in deciding to arrest him, to justify that by the legal outcome to say, well, he was found guilty. So maybe you know, initially, excuse me, the reporting party didn't want to participate or, you know, we didn't think it was a serious situation. If he was found guilty, then all is well. And that outcome actually did not actually that outcome is actually no longer accurate because obviously we know he was found not guilty on appeal. But I think just that logic is not directly attributable to the officers, as we're talking about the outcome of the criminal justice arena, the courtroom. And, you know, sometimes the courtroom gets it right and sometimes the courtroom doesn't get it right. But we're focusing here on not what the outcome of the jury was, but in the actions of the officers and whether they effectuated their duties fairly and professionally. And for that reason, I chose to not sustain on all of the officers involved because obviously, again, it wasn't clear to me what exactly took place during that conversation where their cameras were muted that led to the decision to arrest the complainant. And I believe that sums up all of my my comments on that.
Thank you, Mummy. I just want to point you
You're
out
welcome.
to Mummy's report on page 4, number 2 is the exceptions to the archived DEMS policy, which was relevant at the time of this incident. DEMS being digital evidence management system. And so that's where there are kind of 4 exceptions that were approved in this instance for either audio with no video or video with no audio. And the circumstances here not only don't conform to that, but the disjoint between what the supervising officer said as leading into muting the body worn camera footage, it seemed like, you know, it was, you know, recording would not capture sensitive tactical conversations that could jeopardize future officer safety if released to the public. Or we don't have that information because we don't have that information. So, Captain Kim, I have notes for everything we brought up. So
Sure.
I know it was kind of a,
No, actually,
at different layers.
I think, yeah, and what I would like to do is sort of, there was a lot of questions that were asked at the beginning of this, you know, before we kind of got into this discussion. I think a lot of the questions that Mummy asked were the same questions that the COB had, and so there's a lot of overlap there. And I started to write down sort of all the questions that were posed and, you know, and gather my thoughts on it. So I just want to kind of go through that list. And then if there, at the end of it, if there's additional questions, then I'm happy to answer those too, and then sort of see where we're at right now. So the first question that came up, I think, Julie, you brought up was the body worn camera violation policy, and then, you know, how that's interpreted. And I think you kind of hit the nail on the head, which was basically like, what was the standard customary practice prior to the change in the DEMS policy, which occurred, I believe, in June of 2023. And that was this tactical muting that was taking place by many of the officers was interpreted very loosely, right? What they believed or what they considered to be tactical probably was not the intent of what tactical meant. Tactical means like, hey, we're about to, you know, serve this search warrant on this house. You go around back, I'll go around here, blah, 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 blah. And that kind of stuff you should probably use in the event that that escapes and is FOIA and subpoenaed. People do not want to have, you know, are the ways and means in which we approach homes, because that's an officer safety issue. That somehow got conflated into this hey, whenever I talk about something or I want to have a discussion about something, it's tactical, and so I'll mute it. We've since corrected that with the updated DEMS policy. Now, I will say this, the updated DEMS policy does allow a supervisor to initiate a muting process or a sort of pausing process in the event that he or she feels that that is necessary. And as we discuss this and develop the policy, there are too many scenarios for us to enumerate. We cannot allow officers to say, we didn't want to allow officers to sort of initiate that themselves. The supervisors are responsible for sort of justifying that, and that needs to be captured on the incident report. I asked the officers who were in my presence to mute their cameras for this specific purpose, and that needs to be documented in a case report, right? And that will be reviewed, and someone's going to look at it and be like, well, wait a second, you know? And so if this situation were to occur again, that would be documented in a case report where you all could decide whether or not that was reasonable, that supervisor made that call or not. So those issues, you know, we're trying to balance this because there's so many situations that I could probably talk about that I just, you know, I didn't want to limit us, but we needed to make that available.
Do you have a sense about this one? Because
Yeah.
this is a kind of an interesting one. I mean, I'm not sure if I.
Yeah. So there's a lot of things that are happening for training purposes. If I'm training a recruit or training an FTO and I need to deliver a specific piece of training to them, I would ordinarily say that it's okay to mute that process. I need to tell you something, it's for training purposes. I need to tell you what you did wrong, right? And I don't want that to be captured for everyone to hear and see how you did not do this call correctly. So the reason I'm using training as a thing is, was this a training opportunity for the officers where the supervisor felt maybe you all made the wrong decision on what you all should be doing here? This is a call for service that involved a man potentially who had a knife who was assaulted, who assaulted an individual. Maybe the decision needs to be, he needs to be arrested for assault and battery. And so if that training guise is on there, then I would say that that's okay. If it's just, hey, I want to discuss this legal analysis with you on whether or not we can do this or not, I would say probably no. But if there's a training piece in there, then I would say yes. Then to me, that would conform to what I would say is okay.
I think that's pretty broad, even so. I mean,
He didn't say that in his interview.
No, but
I get it. So what I'm saying is, you're asking me for my opinion on something.
Yeah.
And I said, if there's a training piece there, then I would say yes. If there's not, then the answer is no. So,
But then that makes this a violation of the policy.
no,
Because it's not, it wasn't in effect then.
it was,
No, this is the policy that was in effect then, and none of the reasons here are covered.
yeah, so now let's go back and how policies are generally concerned. We're not going to violate someone on a policy if we've amended a policy to allow this to occur. And so what I said, I went back to what I'm going to say before, is that under the current policy, a supervisor can ask an officer to mute their camera. That's just it. That's what the policy says. I have it right here. You can tell someone to mute their camera. A supervisor has the ability to do that. So if that is the current policy to violate someone on something that occurred before that policy changed, that is not what we do here. That is not the way that laws are enforced in this country, and that is not the way that policies are enforced. So I know you guys have confused looks on their face.
It's not confused, it's the individual took an action that was not consistent with what you all think an officer should have been doing at that time. And even though you changed the policy, the fact that they violated the policy that
At the time,
yeah, it's kind of relevant.
it is relevant, but you go back to the original discussion about how custom and practice had played out. And that was the first topic of what I said, was that the way that it was practiced by this agency was that tactical meant if I was having a legal discussion with you or deciding on how to deal with a call, it was considered tactical. that was the way that it was practiced. I understand what the policy says, but we know now that that was the practice that was occurring at the agency.
Okay, so what you're saying is your understanding is, or we don't know, if that they view this as tactic, we don't know.
But that's not
The
what it said.
issue,
That's-
the issue
yeah.
is this incident happened in May and the interviews were in February. That is an issue because the supervisor, when asked, said that they didn't know, they didn't remember. I mean, that makes it more challenging. And in the old policy, I think it says examples are things alike.
Right.
It wasn't a firm list. It gave some examples. And I think the new policy is more direct.
So
But the
with
challenge we
new-
have here is we don't have the information we need to understand how we went from this incident winding down to a kind of simplified outcome.
We have the officer's recollection to their best of their ability almost 9 months later. And so
But nobody explained why that change was made.
they explained that in their recollection, if the question is, what's the missing piece of this conversation that took place, the officers during their interview said that there was some discussion about whether or not a person could be released on a summons for assault and battery, whether or not that this conformed what evidence was in front of them, that there was two parties both confirming, the victim and the suspect both confirming that an assault had taken place. And there were elements of a crime that met the Virginia statute for an assault and battery. And so that is what they recall to be the discussion. Why they decided to change their mind about how to go is really immaterial for me personally when I look at policy about why this change happens. Officers are allowed to make a change when they're dealing with a call of service. They don't necessarily have to stick with one way on how to deal with a call. Someone could come in as I'm dealing with a call for service and decide, hey, did you think about this? Did you think about this? Did you think about these three factors? And then I might decide, well, I never actually thought about that. I'm going to now change my course of action and do something differently. That is perfectly reasonable and within policy about how these calls can occur and manifest themselves. And any call for service about an accident, about an investigation, these types of things can occur.
But aside,
Oh, sorry.
I was gonna say, aside from the fact that the officer two said before muting herself, I didn't think we were allowed to do that anymore. The supervising officer's comment going into that is, after officer two said she was fine getting off the street, the supervising officer said, I don't think we have to do that, but based on coming here and taking these actions that we took. And that goes to kind of Mummy's point about, does this start to seem punitive to a member of the public who's filing a complaint for being arrested on something that he was later found not guilty of? Like,
Do I think that it was punitive? Is that what you're saying?
no, I'm saying if that's the policy, how do we avoid that can seem punitive?
I don't, yeah, I can see, are you talking about generally or for this specific incident?
I mean, both. This gives us the case study to say, if we don't have the information about how the officers made this decision,
I guess
we
the
have lots of
question,
information
yeah.
that came to their original
Yeah.
decision. And to Mummy's point, no circumstances changed. And the supervising officer going into it, it's difficult. It's a black box.
Yeah, I think it's not necessarily the circumstances, but a re-reflection on the evidence at hand. And so, and that's what I think is what I'm trying to distinguish here. It's not that the circumstances were different, but it's a request that evidence that is available be re-examined. And it's just a small distinction there that I'm trying to make, and then not to belabor the conversation because we started getting a little bit sidetracked with body worn cameras, because we would certainly circle back to this, but I do want to make sure that I hit all the points. And then maybe those things will come up in further discussions, but.
Well, just a bit of clarity
Okay.
for those watching at home. So we do understand that we did have an evolution in the policy. So the policy as it stands today.
Yes.
How would a situation that played out this exact same way work when the policy as it's laid out today?
What would happen is that the supervisor, if they wanted to, could tell the officers to mute their camera and then document that in a case report as to why
Okay.
and then that would be a way to sort of,
Capture.
But it would just, but now in this documentation, it would say, because of X reason, does the documentation also require them to say what was said or just for X reason?
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so then that being the case, now, is it possible that we can arrive at this same, because I hear the concern. The concern was that, especially in training, I actually love that example you put.
Yeah.
Sometimes things happen in training, and we need to be able to feel as though we can talk a little bit, more freely. But the idea was because, we don't want that to get out there. But in large part, this is really just amongst us chickens, you all and us here.
Yeah.
And only when there is something that rises to the point of you all are doing it more in depth and us here having to see it. So it's not as though this thing is posted on the local news. That's what I'm getting at. But we may have situations that the justification to turn it off may be a little weaker than any of us feel comfortable with. So in that instance, I'm familiar with the fact that when people at home may not understand this, but there's some things that we don't hear. They were said, but we don't hear them. Like, for example, if someone's saying their address, we're not going to necessarily hear that, but it was said and it was recorded. They didn't press off. Is it possible that we can arrive at the same protections of someone not feeling embarrassed or someone feeling free to talk by redacting it on the back end? So that if someone.
Great question.
So that if
I know where you're going with this. Yeah.
Supervisor says, hey, I made a note
Yeah.
that this conversation is one that really needs to be one that is redacted. Should anyone?
So the short answer is, I love where you're going with this because I think that would be an easy solution. However, when videos are delivered for evidentiary purposes, they must be unaltered. They cannot be redacted, they cannot be touched, they cannot be clipped. And so I like the idea, but I think if we're gonna use videos for evidence, any alteration of the evidence is going to call into question its authenticity. And so whenever we deliver videos to the Commonwealth Attorney's Office, it is unredacted, unclipped, whatever, so they can present it in its entirety to the defense, who has a right under discovery to get that unredacted, unsolicited video. The only protection to prevent those, which it sounds like you are sensitive to those discussions from being brought out into the public, is to mute it on the front end, is to clip it on the front end and not have to do it on the back end, because the back end taints the evidence.
But the goal is really to limit how frequently this
Right. Right.
I mean, the whole idea that the interaction is captured from beginning to end. There are some times when it is appropriate, This was a conversation, but there's also times, like if you're in somebody's home, there are some circumstances where there has to be that flexibility, but, it's structured intentionally to try to really limit.
So
It's not meant to be something that's used frequently at all.
Right.
So in this case, a tactical, whether tactical,
yeah.
discussion about what steps to take, whether to arrest or not. I mean, that's the fact that we have body worn cameras now versus 10 years ago even makes that a relevant discussion, because you'd never have that before. So it's a pretty significant thing for the public to be able to look at that. And, I'm sure that there are times when it's not clear what an officer should do. And talking to other officers on the scene is going to be like, okay, what do you guys think? And, what the public doesn't want is for some nefarious reason based on race or whatever to be used. So there's value to having those discussions. And I think, coming up with a policy to identify what's to be kept in and what's to be kept out is line drawing, and it sounds like that's what you're trying to do.
It sounds like what you're saying about, there's too many, like before it was A, B, C, or D.
Yeah.
That's not enough to capture all the different reasons, but that for the accountability, you're saying the supervisor has discretion, but then also accountability for documenting.
Correct.
I also think the way the previous policy was written, to me, it's not just those four things. I think there was some fairly large hole in it because it says examples of circumstances that may include but are not limited to. So it's,
Right.
those are just examples.
Right.
And I think that that's not the best policy guidance.
So has that language changed or is it?
Oh, yeah, we really cranked that thing down. It is very tight now. And there are circumstances that are enumerated, but they're very specific, when dealing, with a forensic interview or something like that, or someone who's just unwilling to talk to you because they know you have a body-worn camera, but you have to get their statement. So there is a possibility there, right? If you're like, I'm not gonna talk to you while that camera's on, you're like, okay, but I have to talk to you in furtherance of this investigation. So there are very, very limited circumstances because, there is a deal of, we wanna make sure that we're balancing the need for public transparency. So these types of questions that you have, which I completely understand, don't have to be answered. I'm not guessing about what this decision was. All I can just do is look at basically the same thing that you guys are looking at and making my best educated case, yes, based on my experience, as a police officer, and saying, well, it seems to me like there was a re-examination or a request to re-examine what evidence was available to the officers, and then a different outcome resulted.
But we do want people to be able to explain, because, now that we have all these cameras, when we mute, it adds a lot of questions. So, and we recognize that, but at the same time, we recognize there are some circumstances where that ability has to be there. So I think the best we can do is that when we do that, we need to be able to explain why we did it.
Right.
I mean, I think-
compared just a comparison, just from my own experience with federal agents, they are way behind local law enforcement in terms of body-worn camera.
Yeah.
This whole issue on the need for the public to see what police are doing in their community is so much greater, and local police have gone a lot further than federal agents who don't even wear it when they're collecting evidence. It's literally just, is the scene secure? Then they immediately turn it off. And as soon as you turn it off, you're like, well, what happened next? I mean, that's immediately the reaction. So it's a valuable discussion when,
Yeah. Well, I mean, to me, like, the only reason that it sticks out so much is that while any muting or anything like that begs lots of questions, this one begs a specific question that's just uncomfortable given the facts.
Yeah. And so
There wasn't a consistency in the recollections. It was, well, that person made the decision.
Right.
No, that person made the decision. Well, I don't remember who made the decision, but we did talk, so that part also led to, the mystery behind, again, this about 3 minutes of silence. It's good to hear that the policy's tighter, but it looks like something that we just have to, that we as COB have to just make sure that we keep an eye out on to see if it needs to be tighter.
I think since the policy's changed, you will find very rare circumstances of people muting their camera. It's just not going to happen very often. It may happen. Don't be like, oh, you said it's never going to happen. It will be it will be very rare. Because I watch a lot of videos. It is just incredibly rare now that someone mutes.
so that's good.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we kind of got to the second question, which was what decision led to the arrest. I think we kind of drowned that out. And then you, Charles, you had a specific question about why the court outcome was included in the OPR report, which is not typically done. And you're absolutely right. It is not typically included in an OPR report. I don't think it's necessarily prejudicial because it's internal, right? You guys see it, we see it. It just, but when it's included specifically for this purpose, it's because I knew that there were discussions about whether or not the arrest of this individual was proper or not. And so this is a way of me saying, or the staff or OPR saying, they followed the law, it was legally justified, and in fact, the determination was by a judge who sits in general district court, not a jury. A judge decides that there is, beyond reasonable doubt that this offense took place and finds the individual guilty. Because I think that is germane to whether or not these officers violated the duty and responsibilities policy, because as I know it's fair and professional, but the second part of that is as required and directed by law, policy, procedure, or rules and regulations. And so by making the argument that this individual was, found guilty in a court of law, that means that the officers did not have any search or seizure violations. There's no whatever violations of constitutional rights. There's no violations of Miranda or anything like that. So they followed all the laws, policies, and procedures, and a judge says, okay.
But that
Guilty.
conviction was vacated, which wasn't.
So I understand that, but
So you're right that it's germane, but I wouldn't say this, it's not dispositive.
it's not dispositive. You're
Right.
100, and I would never suggest that that is dispositive, because as I think what Mummy mentioned before was guilty or not guilty, sometimes the court
Yeah.
probably doesn't get it right all the time. And I think we can name a bunch of circumstances where the court just did not get it right, even though they were, yes, but either or both ways.
Right.
But this is just a piece of evidence to suggest that the duty and responsibilities policy was followed. It's not necessary. It's not intended to be anything else other than that. And again, it's internal. It's an internal document for us. It's an internal document for you. And then when we write these things, it's for both audiences, us and you, right? So as we write these documents, there is a cognition or a realization that there is a second audience that is looking at this. This is not just an internal document. This is a document that is provided to you for your awareness and understanding as well.
But if it cuts that way because he was found guilty, why doesn't it cut the other way when that was vacated by a jury?
Can I answer that? So when I read that, the complainant started out with, there was a concern or angst that the caller wasn't arrested for filing a false police report. So indicating he had done that. When I personally read that, what it said to me is that, the standard for the judge in general district is proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The standard for an arrest is probable cause. That was the connection that I made when I read it. And I remember when I read it, that's what hit me. That's what it spoke to me.
Wait, I don't understand the relevance of the reporting false.
Ultimately who was the victim in this, the person who was touched, the complaint was that person should have been arrested for filing a false police report, so that this didn't happen at all.
He's saying,
but a judge found that there was proof beyond a reasonable doubt, which is well above the probable cause threshold. That's how I heard it when I read it. It's here or there, I'm just sharing it with you. I remember my reaction when I read it.
Right, and I guess that goes to my statement that it seems a little highly prejudicial in Julie's but does it then cut the same way? So like, for example,
Or
let's
that
say.
it's incomplete in the
Right.
report.
Well, in the
Say
report
that
it is,
a
but,
judge
right.
found them guilty and then a jury
That was-
found them not guilty.
So then, how would that have, we're only speculating, but, with someone, and not necessarily you, but
yeah.
as much as I can see how someone would say, oh, well, hold on a minute, there was a third party out there who looked at these same things and said, hey, maybe, but then again, if it comes out the other way where then it's, they're found not guilty, then it's like, okay, well then maybe she.
Yes,
this person
so.
did say something that was false,
Yeah, so let's not get wrapped around the guilty, not guilty, because that's the inclusion of this had two purposes. The second purpose was that the victim in this case didn't want to prosecute. And I made it very clear in my addendum that not only did this person appear once, not only did they appear twice to testify against this individual, they appeared 3 times. Okay, the first time they appeared, the court case was continued. The second time they appeared, they took the stand and testified against this individual. The third time they appeared, and they testified in a jury trial, which is very lengthy. That is an all-day affair. So to say that this person wanted nothing to do with this incident, it's just not accurate. You don't show up to court 3 times and take the entire day off if you want nothing to do with this incident. clearly at the time of this incident, maybe you were a little bit overwhelmed, a little bit fearful. She says, you know, that she went to her boyfriend and was crying, you know, that's what she reports to the officers. And he's like, yeah, she came over to me and she was crying. She was obviously, you know, very taken aback by this entire incident. So upon reflection, this individual clearly decides, you know what? I was a victim of a crime. I do want to prosecute. I do want to testify against this individual. Does it twice. That's also the second purpose of adding that in, is that this victim has decided to assist in the prosecution of this case 3 times. So that's the second piece of that. Let's move on to pat downs, timely, and gloves. Great question. And Mummy brought this up in her thing. Was the pat down timely? No. I mean, there's no way for me to say that. You are right. It was not time. I think you guys kind of figured that out when you're kind of hinting at it. I'm telling you, it just was not timely. That should have been done a little bit faster. You know, especially like you said, you're dealing with individuals with knives that you've identified as the potential suspect, blah, blah, blah. That needs to occur once the handcuffs are on. I mean, like you think you have reason to articulate suspicion to believe that this person is armed and presently armed and dangerous, has committed an assault. So that clearly meets the threshold of the Terry v. Ohio case. It just wasn't done in a timely manner. Secondly is this question about gloves, and that is a great question. And there is no policy specifically saying you got to put gloves on. I understand that the complainant in this case had a sort of an aversion to being touched. That was clear and evident, and we need to be mindful of that. And the reason why, I'll tell you why there's a reason why there's no policy that says you have to have gloves on. Because incidents like this, where you need to do a quick pat down, you don't have time to put on gloves. And if the requirement is that we always have to make our officers put gloves on in order to pat people down, that creates an officer safety issue, right? Sometimes you just need to get your hands dirty, and for officer safety reason, you know, put your hands on people without gloves on. I don't personally like doing it, but what I also don't want to see is officers driving around and interacting with community members with gloves on all the time. Because I think that's a very hardened look too, right? And so it's this sort of balance of being like, we want to make sure that, again, we're approachable. We don't want to restrict our officers, you know, and make it so anytime they touch a person, they have to put gloves on. And so, you know, that's a way of me sort of answering that question to the best of my ability, which is like, I would never recommend creating a policy which requires people to put gloves on. It's smart. You probably should if you have time. But, you know, to say that it's mandatory, yeah, I think that's a bridge too far.
Are they provided gloves though?
Yes, great question. You are provided latex gloves, and they're abundant, and you can get as many as you want. Carry them in your car. A lot of the people that work on crime scenes that take pictures and collect evidence, they have, you know, a plethora of gloves inside their cars. You just go down there, and we keep them off hours too in the evidence area, where you can just, you know, if the property section isn't open, you can grab a box of gloves and carry them around in your car.
So the request isn't beyond the pale to say, can we do this with gloves on?
Oh, I'm sorry, what's that?
So the request wasn't beyond the pale?
No, to say, hey, can you put some gloves on beforehand? Do I think that that's a reasonable request to make? He's already being detained. It's late already. It's been 25 minutes into this. I get what you're saying. Like, I get what you're saying. That's not an unreasonable request to make. So this is a big topic. This is the next question. The number of officers at 6 and why, and I know this came up probably on the very first investigation that we went over. Is this number, and is there a policy, and what's the right number, and what should we do? And, you know, I think there's a way to look at this, which is, I think we can all agree that for a call of this nature with a man who is allegedly assaulted another individual with a knife in a restaurant, you probably want many, many officers responding to the scene. But again, upon realizing that this may not exactly be everything that it was marked up to be, we can start releasing people. When that transition takes place is a little bit difficult for me to say definitively, because as I watch the video, I see everyone doing something initially, right? I've got 2 people talking to witnesses. I've got 2 people talking to the complainant. I've got someone talking maybe to the manager. They're all kind of going back and forth. One person's kind of sitting back and sort of like managing the whole thing, trying to figure out what's happening. That's all happening from the onset. One person goes out and says, hey, there's a request for a supervisor. I needed that. So this is very task-oriented, which requires many people to be involved in. And having just 2 people there would make that all those tasks very difficult. But there is a transition probably there at some point, you know, and maybe when it's the supervisor arrives on scene that the number is not needed anymore. Most of that preliminary investigation has been completed. Most of the evidence collection and the people that we need to talk to has been done, and we're kind of in a good place. But as I recall, that supervisor who responded to the scene actually asked 2 people to leave, right? He sends them on their way. 2 of them leave. When he's like, he gets there and he's like, you guys aren't doing anything, you know, skedaddle. And then now he's left with a much smaller group of people that he does the consultation with at the table and then sort of has this discussion with. There's always going to be a need to balance officer safety with, you know, reserving resources and also, you know, making sure that there's not an appearance of sort of sending too many people. You know, I know the word has been used before, but like over policing. You know, there's always that's going to be a need to do that. But as we break this down segment by segment, piece by piece, I thought the transitions of the sort of sending people on their way occurred. Maybe they were a little bit longer, but I thought they were still within a reasonable. I could look at that and be like, I think that's still reasonable. People are still task oriented here. Everyone has an assigned task that they're doing. It's not like a bunch of people just standing around, you know, at the business and doing nothing. I felt like everyone was doing a task. And I think part of the charge for the Community Oversight Board is to sort of, as you observe these things more and more often and sort of get, you know, inoculated to this sort of an understanding a little bit more, maybe that will help sort of bridge the understanding for the public, if that makes sense. Does that make sense? Okay, perfect.
We do have these conversations. I mean, you know, we have to make sure that the scene is safe for everybody, but there is a time when it's like, if people start running out of things to do, and, you know, it's easy if I'm the supervisor and I show up and I see people standing around. We're trying to make it, or if it doesn't have to be a supervisor, if you realize you're standing around, like,
Yeah.
I'm out. So it's these conversations happen because, you know, 1, we are short-staffed, we need people out. 2, we don't need 6 people on a call that at this point needs 2 people.
Right.
It's a work in progress.
Yeah, and I think the chief hit the nail on the head, and I'm glad he brought that up, is they do talk about that in roll call, about a lot, about being like, hey, just be mindful if you're standing around not doing anything, go in service. We don't need 100 people at a call. And that's just kind of like what you said, Anika, like handle other calls for service, you know? And you know, selfishly, I'm just tell you selfishly, if I have 10 people standing around with body-worn cameras running and someone FOIAs the incident, now I have 10 body-worn cameras that I need to sort of look through and redact. And I'm like, it's unnecessary. I do not need that. So, you know what I mean? Did it take 10 people? Well, no, I got like 10 hours of video that I got to go through, or not me, but my staff have to go through to push that out because there's been a FOIA request for something. So trust me, it is on everybody's mind. Everyone has skin in the game about trying to manage this to the best of our ability. But balancing that with officer safety, because safety is always going to come first, you know?
One thing I want to add, because you're talking about the court disposition.
Yeah.
I looked it up, and the circuit court was March 25th. The date on the IA report is March 11th. So that may be why it's not in there. Just something I looked up a second ago.
Thank you. The next piece talked about officer identification. And then this, and I'll segue into the sort of the policy discussion about supervisor. Officer identification, I would say this, there are a lot of times that people ask for an officer's name and badge number. And then as I watch the video and I'm like, their name is on their vest. Why are they doing that as sort of a, hey, I'm gonna be defiant or whatever, and I'm gonna ask you for your badge number. You're like looking down and you're like, wait a second, my name is right there. Why are you asking me for my name? It's like literally Velcroed on my chest. There is a policy that says that, you know, when someone asks that you will provide them your name and badge number, and I believe those officers follow that. We do provide business cards in property. You can order them. You can just say, hey, I want to make business cards. Here's what I want it to look like. There's a template that you can make, and you can have the property section order you a box of cards. And
Is
so
that true for everybody? Remember, it used to be generic cards for patrol. I was thinking that when that came up, and I have to go check.
I gotta.
I'm also thinking, I don't want 10 cards going home from a scene, right? So
Right.
like writing it down on the back of one card, so I have one piece of paper to manage, makes sense to me. I mean,
Oh, on a scene where there's 10 people, but I would say that as much as our previous conversation was about, 6 or more people, I think the lion's share of interactions are probably more 1 or 2 on one. And in those situations, we've seen also where a card's not on on them sometimes, so you have to scramble for a piece of paper.
But
something
we'll
like
get
that.
back to the answer.
But to your point, when it is a lot, yes, but again, we're still finding the piece of paper, finding the
Yes.
officer took the time to say,
A piece of notepad, yes.
can you read what I'm writing? Is it legible? Cards solve that. If you have that. So it's just, to what extent are officers, again, provided with that form of identification when it comes to that? When it comes to cars, to what extent have we looked into having better identification of our car numbers? I know that on other things, being able to readily identify a car number has come up.
We standardized the car numbering system several years ago.
As in the visibility, not the standardizing the car number.
I believe the visibility is in alignment with the regional sort of look of the vehicles, and it's all standardized now. There's a big project that was done several years ago to standardize the location of the number, the placement of where the number is. And, and I believe now they are still on the hood of the cars. I mean, not the hoods, the roof of the cars. Yes.
What's the specific, because they're on both sides in the back. Was there a specific thing?
We may have to talk about, I don't know if we can talk about it here.
Okay.
But I readily recall looking at complaints where the issue was that the person was not able to readily identify the number. Then also a complaint that when we, as in between OPR and OIPA, were trying to investigate the way the cameras were placed, weren't able to identify the particular number of the car either. And so I was like, well, this is interesting. Let's see what we can, just see online. So just look up car. And I was like, look up how our cars are. And I was looking, I was like, well, okay, I can see if something is driving down the street, kind of fast. It's not the big, of course, it's not as big as it's on the roof, but no one's going to move a car. But
Yeah.
even then, it's like, okay, the lower left panel, it's not, the back door, for example. It's the lower left panel, the lower front panel. So it's like, well, maybe there's something we can do where that number can be bigger than this.
I mean, we can.
But that goes to cars.
Yeah.
But there's just other different ways that we like you said, it's right there.
Yeah.
On our ride-alongs, it's right there.
Yeah.
And it may just be something that deals with when jackets are there, or when other types of things are worn that maybe there's a feeling that that's obscured. But again, you're dealing with folks generally in these situations, at least when it comes to reporting, where they're seeing things not in the casual conversation we're having.
Sure.
They're saying, so things need to be a little bit bigger than not, or a little bit more
Sure.
pronounced than not. Or in the case of, the great example of the cards, which is just something that it's come up. Then
You mean the business
business cards,
cards?
Right.
Yes.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, right, yes,
Yeah.
has come up enough times to be memorable that it's, oh, I don't have one, let me get a piece of paper and write it down.
Let me check, and because the chief and I were talking, we're not 100% certain that business cards can be ordered for every officer. I want to say yes, but I obviously I haven't been a patrol officer in a long time, and I know they've sort of enhanced who can get a business card. But you're right. This, like, if you don't have a business card, you can tear off a piece of, your notepad, write your name and badge number. Business cards do help. But then it's obviously, I'm an officer that deals with a member of the public all the time. And actually, I do frequently run out of cards on my person. Not that I don't have them. I don't carry a bunch of them with me on my person all the time.
Right, which is understandable.
Yeah, so let me get back to you because now I'm curious to know that answer. So I will figure out that answer. The car thing, again, I believe, we are in alignment with the rest of the region as far as placement and visibility of the vehicle numbers. I think the question would be, are there other ways to identify the car other than the number that would make it possible? And that's something that I haven't really thought about until you brought it up, and maybe this is certainly a topic for discussion because redecaling vehicles is a thing. So, yeah. Yeah. And then we also have a plethora of unmarked vehicles too, and so the car number does not solve the car issue. And that's what I'm trying to think globally. If there's a concern about how do we identify police cars, I think looking beyond a number is probably a better
Citizen should see an officer's name on a badge, providing your name is a professional courtesy of any public servant. It's normal and should be expected. And I mean, I think in general, we've seen a lot of best practice from officers who, introduce themselves as part of that. I mean, I agree. Gary, your hand's raised. Do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, thank you, guys. And I'm sorry for being gone too. I look forward to meeting Cecilia. Yeah, I understand exactly what Captain Kim is talking about. That many times people are trying to change the dynamics, of a human, officer to citizen encounter by, what's your name? I totally agree with you, Captain Kim, that people many times are trying to impact the dynamics of the conversation, or, I can ask the name. But I guess my take on this, having been a public servant for almost my whole life, whether it's in the military or, in the board here, is that, to me, that is a responsibility of being a servant. Yeah, safety is number one. I agree with you. Everything said tonight's good, but it's what distinguishes a professional servant of the community. Yeah, even if they are using that reason, and I've been there before, what's your name, and I say, I'm General, so I'm Gary. I'm Gary Dean, and that's not an affront on me. I recognize it. So I just wanted to share that, not take a lot of time, is that it's a very small thing, and we're not giving up, the officer's not giving up any position or authority or anything like that. But I think that it can help in most cases. This whole community and police, we're all one community, and hey, I acknowledge it, but I opine the other way, that says I think a better approach that can help de-escalate things is to, hey, I'm Officer Smith, because I've been there before where somebody says, well, don't you see my name badge? Where I've been in a difficult situation, either no sleep or whatever, and I go, oh, it's right there in front of me. So yeah, I just think it's an easy way. We're talking about badges and cards, and I don't know. I think the simple thing for any servant is just, hey, my name is blah blah blah, boom, end of story. But I do acknowledge the concern Captain Kim raised. Thank you.
Thanks, Gary.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. And I don't want, I didn't want to make it sound like I was saying, well, just because you have it on your vest or whatever, you don't have to tell the person your name. You absolutely do. But I was just saying, sometimes someone will say, they'll be staring right at you, and I want your name and badge number. Well, my name is kind of right there. So, I just wanted that to be recognized and be like, 'cause sometimes that happens. So, okay.
They might be very excited though, or upset.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I would always advocate if they want it on a piece of paper, or they want you to say it slowly, or like spell it out or whatever. Absolutely, 100%. That's part of making sure that you're being a good public servant. I wholeheartedly agree with that statement. The last piece, and I know this has come up in discussion a couple of times, is the request for a supervisor. And so the question is there a specific policy that addresses whether or not an officer is required to call a supervisor? The answer is no. There is not a specific policy that addresses that piece. However, as we have found in many circumstances in the past, as I've looked at these things with my staff, if there is a denial of that, an unreasonable denial of that, that would be viewed as personal contacts. That would be something that we would view as personal contacts. Someone has made a legitimate request to you, and you are, for whatever reason, you are not, allowing this request to proceed through. That, to me, yes, would be a violation of public trust if it's reasonable, And I think in this case, the complainant makes, after a little bit of back and forth, he decides for whatever reason, and I actually don't think he was that overly excited. I actually did not find him to be overly excited during this encounter. A request for a supervisor, and he asks, one of the officers asks, hey, why do you want one? As we discussed before, kind of gives him the reason. It's like, okay, that sounds reasonable, I had this long conversation with Mummy about whether or not we should develop this policy. And I think the concern is that when you try to, because I noodled this through with my staff to be like, hey, do you think we can design something like that? What we don't want to do is create a situation where our supervisors, all they do all day is literally go from call to call, or answer calls, or call people, or on the phone with citizens, instead of supervising the officers that they are assigned to. There are 100% going to be circumstances where they have to show up on scene because they need to de-escalate a situation, as we discussed before. And they should be doing that anyways. If you are an engaged supervisor out on the street in patrol, you are going to check in with your officers, especially the more sort of volatile calls that go out. Maybe you're saying, hey, I just heard this call go out. It sounds pretty kinetic or something like that. Maybe I'll just check in and see how everyone's doing. That's what engaged supervisors do, to sort of check in on their folks, make sure that they don't need anything. And, I think this is a long way of me saying, I've certainly thought about this, because this has come up a couple of times. And if this becomes to a point, I think the chief may have an opinion on this. If it comes to a point where officers are not doing the right thing and not using their sort of, thinking caps and big boy pants and making good decisions, then that may be time to address that. But in other circumstances, when a supervisor has been requested, that has been acknowledged. It has come. The supervisor has arrived on scene. So until that circumstance comes where, we're looking at something and this person has made a legitimate, request for a supervisor and no one shows up, I'd be like, okay, now it's either this individual is an anomaly and he or she needs to be addressed, or maybe it's time to have a broader discussion about policy. And then I'll open the floor to the chief, because he's the one who ultimately decides.
No, I agree. I've not experienced where normally somebody says, I want to see a supervisor. And the question is the supervisor available now? Can it be done? Does it need to be in person? Can it be later? I mean, that's all stuff that just has to be worked out. But I honestly believe the practice is that when somebody asks for a supervisor, person will call their supervisor, whether they're available and can get there right now. I mean, that
Yeah.
changes by the minute, but to my best knowledge, is like that request is honored, and it should be honored. You know, but it's fair to me to have a conversation of like, they're gonna be an hour, do you wanna wait an hour? And if we can't wait an hour, or if the officer can't wait an hour, they can arrange a time to meet later, whatever. It's just gotta be figured out somehow, but my experience has been is like, when people ask, that's not been something that the officer's been willing to do, because it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, to me, I'd like, and I understand the desire not to make a formal policy out of it, but that as we look at these things, and Gary may still have his hand up. Mommy, I'll have you weigh in a second. What I do agree with Mommy pointing out was, you know, like when the supervising officer did respond to this call, he didn't, you know, think to excuse the other officers before asking the complainant to, you know, say what his complaint was. And that, again, I don't know that that's something I would ever codify in policy, but there's a kind of best practice to what Mommy was saying, that like, if Lisa and I are having an altercation and I ask to speak with her supervisor to de-escalate, generally, it's best practice with so many other officers on hand to kind of like swap out and have somebody who's not Lisa, sorry, I should have made myself the bad guy. If Lisa was my supervisor, I should, you know, keep doing it for risk of aggravating, right? And so that's just a comment. Like I said, I recognize that level of kind of culture would be cumbersome in policy, but I think as administrative practice, you know, best practice.
That's fair.
It's just, you know, qualitative feedback that like, it's a way to reduce the strain of somebody, you know, who already feels that way. And so I think, you know, he did ask the officers to step away when the complainant pointed that out. So it was just a kind of a stray comment, but Mommy, did you want to add something? Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that the recommendation is not necessarily that a supervisor has to come every time they're called. But what I have a problem with is someone asking to speak with a supervisor and an officer saying, I don't have to call a supervisor, or why do you want me to call a supervisor? Or if you do X, then I will call a supervisor. Because my concern is that those comments or that negotiation, not saying that I can necessarily infer the officer's intent. So I'm not saying that I know, you know, why the officer is asking those questions. And I think certainly asking why a supervisor is, you know, needed, if it's not already obvious, is necessary so that you can communicate to the supervisor why they need to be called to the scene. My concern is that the experience of the person on the other side of that conversation who's already in a dynamic where they are not in a position of power, it can cause unnecessary like friction and intimidation in an encounter. And I think that what should happen in that situation is the supervisor should make a decision as to whether or not they can come out to the scene, depending obviously on whatever the other you know, things are that's on their plate and the level of severity of the situation. And if the supervisor determines that they're not going to come to the scene, then the supervisor can follow up with that person afterwards. But it takes the officer out of the equation, and it allows for the situation that, you know, inevitably an officer is going to and is going to have the level of, you know, power of authority in that circumstance because of just the nature of the dynamic. But it helps to kind of make the dynamic slightly more equitable when someone feels like they have a kind of a neutral process by which to file a complaint. And that's what I'm advocating for.
I agree with Mummy that making a statement to an individual, whether or not you agree or disagree with what they're saying, of, well, I don't have to call a supervisor if I don't want to, is not the public look that I would like to see, and I'm sure the chief can agree with me, that we want to see from our officers. That does not engender public trust. So I do agree. And again, if that continues to happen, maybe there needs to be a broader discussion, but, you know, it's certainly something that I am cognizant of, that I don't necessarily like seeing it. I don't like hearing it. I'm going to be very honest with you. I don't like seeing it and I don't like hearing it. And that needs to be perhaps communicated downward to the people that are interacting most with citizens. So.
So we have all supervisor meetings period. I mean, The command staff meets a couple of times a month, but we have 3 or 4 times a year, we have all supervisor meetings. So some of these things are things that we can bring up and discuss in that meeting too.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay. The only thing else was that some of the officers weren't interviewed, not for policy violations, but to address some of this like missing and unrecalled information.
Yeah, there was only one person, I think, that was in that conversation that was not interviewed. And that was, I can't remember the officer's number, but I think it was Officer 5 that was in that conversation that was not interviewed. So Officer 1 was in the conversation, Officer 2 was in the conversation. The supervising officer obviously had that conversation, and I think Officer 5 we did not interview, but officers 3 and 4 were dismissed. Yeah, and four was not part of that conversation. There was one officer that we elected not to interview because their interaction with this individual was just so minimal. And then Officer, I can't remember the numbers, Officer 3-ish, who had almost no interaction. Officer 3 had, I don't think he said 2 words to the complainant. And Officer 4 is no longer an employee here, so we could not interview him. So, you know, I understand we're trying to balance. Again, there's a lot of body worn camera footage, and so when we sort of flush this out, you know, we're kind of trying to make the best decision that we possibly can with not overly burdening them, you know, about interviewing people. We don't like to interview people unnecessarily. And so, yeah, there was a decision made that Officer 5 was not going to be interviewed because of his minimal interaction, not putting the handcuffs on the complainant, and just, I don't know if he could have provided any more clarity to something that occurred 9 months ago. So, you know, I just not see that as a fruitful venture.
Is your hand raised anew?
I can't tell.
So you're speaking.
Sorry, were you all asking me a question?
Your hand was raised. I didn't know if it was still raised or raised again.
Oh, okay. No, it was still raised from the last time, but regarding the officer interviews, my position is just that if officers are, if there are allegations pertaining to any officers, like they're subjects in any way, that they should always be interviewed for purposes of just getting a full perspective of everything that happened, not just the muted part.
Thank you. Okay, so I think we probably have enough basis to make recommendations, and our feeling was consistent with IPA and OPR for most of them, where and Captain Kim, can you speak to the supervising officer not being included in the preliminary and follow-up investigations, just to refresh our memory?
Let me look real quick. I had to write an addendum to this. So
duty and responsibilities, or duty responsibilities?
No, so my addendum actually included preliminary. Yes.
Okay.
Yes, my addendum. I issued an addendum.
I looked at it.
Yeah, it was a typographical error. But yes, it was. But if you look at my addendum, all the corresponding allegations are correctly attached to the officer.
Okay, so did you recommend he was exonerated for?
Yes, correct, yes, if that's your question, yes.
Sure.
Supervising officer 5.
Preliminary.
Oh, no, I'm sorry, yes, supervising officer.
What allegations are?
Preliminary and follow-up investigation. So Anika and I agreed that we can exonerate all of the officers on all of the potential policy violations except duty and responsibilities, where because we're missing the information about how they made that ultimate decision, we can't say that it was a fair and professional arrest. So recommending not sustained on that. We can vote on those separately if anyone has questions or wants to chat. Dave, let's,
I mean, I actually feel like on that issue in terms of not sustaining, I mean, because the policy to keep the body worn camera on was not formally implemented at that time, we don't have the information, but I don't feel like we can ding them just for that. And I feel like if we had some information that indicated there was a problem with the way they handled the ultimate decision, which from the complainant's perspective might well look like I called a supervisor, I was told I wasn't going to be arrested, and lo and behold, I get arrested. And the first two sentences before the body worn camera turns off are, I came over here, which started me thinking in the wrong direction. Like, wait a minute, you're going to make a different decision because you came here, like you invested your time and now you've got to get something out of it. But we don't have any evidence that that's the case. So, I mean, I'm leaning towards exonerating because I feel like in terms of rule following, there's no reason that I can think of. I don't like it, but it's the policy to record at that time was not fully implemented in that way. And they can change their mind, and I don't mind that. I mean, that's totally fine. Like, the guy had an actual like box cutter knife on him, which wasn't, you know, I mean, where that fits in atmospherically, it wasn't what the complainant said. She thought he had in his hand. She said it was something that had a serrated edge, likely the plastic knife that he still had in his hand. But I don't know. I just feel like, you know, it's okay for officers to confer. I think they should confer. And there were differences. There were different recollections as to how that conversation went. And
Well, there was no recollection of why the decision was made. There was some.
well, there was a
differing opinion
statement that one of the
who
officers
made
said. What the one officer did say in the interview that it was because the complainant spoke to the supervising officer and told him that he was something specific, like that he had specifically confirmed that he had assaulted the woman, touched the complainant. But that's what he had already said that. He had already said that to the very first officer. So I was like, well, that can't actually be the
My issue isn't the body worn camera violation here. It's that I can see that, like, you know, where we go with the simplest explanation is sometimes the best, that like I can see why it could feel retaliatory. That like I called a supervisor and that, you know, feels bad. And so after all of this, now I'm going to be charged for the crime that she didn't want to press charges against, and we were ready to let me go. And that's, I'm not saying it is. I don't think we can sustain the allegation, but I don't think we can.
Well, sorry to interrupt. I just want to make sure I'm following the conversation. Are we talking about a body worn camera policy, like a DEMS violation, or are we talking about duties and responsibilities?
No, in
yeah,
duty and responsibilities, it says, you know, fair and professional. And
yes, but we were talking about the body worn camera, and that's why I thought we were talking about the duties and responsibilities, but I'm talking about the body worn camera.
no, we are talking. No. I'm not talking about the body worn camera. I'm saying.
Well, I was. Maybe, you know.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So, so what would the articulation be as to what precisely was unfair and unprofessional?
The decision to arrest him on this like pretty minor incident where the reporting party says, I don't want to press charges, and walks away and leaves the scene. And they've already told him twice, you're not going to be arrested. And I understand that you can change your mind, but we can't say whether or not that was fair and professional because we don't know.
Missing two.
So that's what I'm saying. I'm not saying it was unfair. I'm saying I can't say that it was fair and professional.
But the supervisor's not the one who said, we're not going to charge you.
No, but the supervisor also said, I don't think we have to do that. I'm speaking about the overarching decision at the end to say, we are going to arrest you, right? That determination was made in a group. And so the situation changed from, she doesn't want to press charges. There's no outstanding threat. He's not disorderly. You know, we really don't have basis here except that he had a knife in his pocket, which, to your point, was not the knife that was referenced necessarily. And so,
but that's not the basis for the assault allegation.
No,
the knife in his pocket.
Right, was
Actually-
touching.
Right.
But that, like, when you take into account the context of this assault, right? Like, I'm being cornered in a bathroom in a public place, I have these sensitivities, and I didn't, I didn't push her away, I like grabbed her arm, which she put in my personal space. And that's kind of why it seemed like very quickly upon, coming to the scene, it's like, there's not really anything here because she doesn't want to press charges and.
So my view is it's a binary thing. Either they have the authority and it's a justifiable arrest with probable cause, or it isn't. And the fair and professional goes to the manner in which they carry it out. I think they did in fact have probable cause, because the complainant admitted to the assault. And it's gone both ways. The district court said it was a violation, a crime. Later they said it was. It's a close call. Like, this is a very close call. And so to me, the fair and professional goes to the manner. I think they did have probable cause to arrest him. The initial decision from the officers was, we're not going to arrest him. I could see that. I could also see that they could choose to arrest him. And they ended up choosing to arrest him. But I don't know that I see information that supports that it was not fair and professional, because we don't have the actual guts of their back and forth. We probably would have if the current policy was in place, which is why I was bringing up the body-worn camera.
Yeah, I think what Julie is saying is we don't know, not that it isn't, but we don't know.
But what we do know is that the only circumstance that changed was that he asked to speak to a supervisor.
Yeah, but the supervisor came and discussed it with his colleagues, and they decided.
But it's this appearance that, like, that's retaliatory. Or punitive.
Yeah, I mean, I can totally understand that. I actually just, it might appear that way to the complainant, but I don't know that, to me, that there's evidence that it was,
I'm gonna jump in again, but maybe I might suggest, because some of these cases that we review, they're kind of close calls, and what always helps me is to go back and actually read the definitions of what each allegation, how it's defined, the finding. And that may help you provide some clarity on what the central question is that you're trying to answer in determining what your finding is. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah, but what we're reading is an employee shall perform duties in a fair and professional manner as required or directed by.
No, I mean what the finding should be, not the allegation. So like the difference between exonerate versus not sustain versus sustain. Meaning like exonerate means the action happened and it was within policy. Not sustain meaning you can't tell either way. Essentially, I'm paraphrasing. And then sustain is beyond a preponderance of the evidence that the underlying conduct did occur and violate the policy.
So Julie is saying not sustain because she's saying we don't know.
We don't know.
That's right.
But that assumes then that there's some problem with it. And
no, there's no assumption. The only thing is we don't know.
We don't know why the decision changed from one thing to the other, so we don't know that it was fair.
We don't know that it wasn't fair.
Right.
We don't know that it was fair. We don't know that it wasn't fair. The information is missing. Therefore, you can't make a final determination, which is why they're saying not sustained. That's why they're saying that, because you cannot make a clear determination. We can run all kinds of scenarios in our heads where it made perfect sense for them to do it.
And like we always do.
Where it didn't, and it was perhaps punitive. The problem is we don't know because we don't have the information.
Well, and what we regularly try to do is say, what is the officer's perspective? What are they thinking at the time, and what is their perspective? And it was, make sure that this situation is secured and yada, yada, yada. From the complainant's perspective, I've just gone from a situation where I was told that I'm going to be, released, and then I'm not, and that could seem unfair from the community.
So if the body-worn camera had captured the discussion,
we would know that it was because I don't know why.
It would be sufficient evidence.
Like, we haven't been able to speculate that in here either, right? Like, none of the interview testimony speaks to how this decision was made. And I'm not saying that a decision can't be changed, but is it changed for a good reason that, like, it was already determined and communicated that, like, something changed and we don't know what. But we can also vote, and you can vote differently.
No, I totally legitimate. It's kind of a close call still for me, because the assumption that there's something unfair just because you don't have the evidence means that you are assuming that there could be something unfair. And
But there
I
could
guess
be
that-
something unfair.
No, we're saying the policy
Well,
says
there
that it
could
has
be,
to
but
be
there
fair
could-
and
I mean-
professional.
Right, and on the face of it, I don't see anything that's unfair or unprofessional, on the face of it.
If you were told that you weren't gonna be arrested and then suddenly you were, you wouldn't feel like you would want an explanation about why?
Giving him an explanation,
Could have made it fair.
so it's that he didn't, so it was the complainant wasn't told why he was arrested, or why they actually made the decision.
Why it changed
Why
from one
it changed,
situation
and that's
to
the
the other.
evidence that's missing. Because even in the recollections, there was no recollection that said, oh, because
The reason
of,
is
and this is what happened in that conversation. All we know is
Yeah.
something happened in 2 minutes and 50 seconds. And we don't know what it was. That's the insufficient evidence. I mean, I'm just looking at that
Yeah.
insufficient evidence part. That's it.
Yeah.
But Dave,
okay.
you're the one who's assuming
Right.
that it was fair. You're making an assumption based on limited evidence, which is fine, you're
So, but
entitled
could
to
it
do
be
that.
unfair if they have probable cause to do it? That's my real question.
Yeah, that's,
I
but
guess it
that's not
could be,
the
because
issue. To
I mean,
me.
It's
when
not
we have
about
a
making the
problem-
arrest. The arrest is legitimate, but the decision to go from
But
Conducting your
that's-
duties
that's
in
that's
a
the
fair and
problem. If the arrest is
professional manner.
legitimate, then
Okay,
how can
but
it be
we,
unfair?
Well, I also struggle
early
to
on
see
we
this
had-
arrest as legitimate because it's very minor. It's understandable circumstance. Like, I recognize
I
that the
agree
legal
with you. I agree
definition
with
of
you.
assault,
I agree with you on
is
that.
touching,
It's totally
but that
borderline.
it's like,
Right.
I
It's totally
would probably put my hand on somebody that was in my way coming out of the bathroom if I felt,
I agree.
caught off guard.
Can I
And I
just
wouldn't be thinking I'm
interject?
assaulting this person.
I just want to answer, I'm sorry, I don't want to stop, but early on, we had a case that had to do with a traffic stop. And the officer said himself that he wasn't going to give the person a ticket, but then he gave him a ticket because he got irritated with the guy. You see what I'm saying? He was allowed to do it, but why did he do it? You got it? So it's not, just because you can do it,
Good memory.
doesn't mean that you did it for,
A fair and professional reason.
for,
Mhm.
there
Okay,
wasn't, that's what we're saying.
Professional manner.
Yeah. Okay.
That's what I'm saying.
No, I think that's a valuable point. I think it's a valuable point.
And we don't want officer, and I'm not saying they were being punitive, but that case with the traffic stop really bugged me because you don't want police officers
Being
saying,
petty
I don't
and
like you, you're irritating me.
yeah.
I'm allowed to give you a ticket, so here you go. I mean, that's not, to me, that's not,
Well, it doesn't
public
broker
service.
trust,
no.
which is our purpose.
Right. Actually, I think
The
that's.
fact that you
that's right.
can do it. Now, I have no problem with the fact that they did it in this case because I do think it was a close call. But the problem is we don't know why they changed their minds.
All right, you know what? You
That's
convinced me.
Oh, good. You
Well, I was
Yeah,
gonna say,
yeah.
I still think it's valuable when we don't have a
Well, we never get to
unanimous
discuss these things,
agreement.
like as a group, which is crazy. Like,
Right.
that's an
Yeah.
issue for the board. Like, we should be able to sit down and discuss these before we get to the meeting, I think, but we can't. So,
Yeah.
anyway.
Don't
So
be
out there in TV land, these are the things that, you should know about some of the restrictions that we do have on the commission, but how we can talk, and that's something that, they should be empowered to talk to the board, and talk to state legislators about giving us more authority to be able to have more fruitful conversations about
Yeah.
Right.
in this commissioner's opinion.
Yeah.
Well, I also just want to reiterate for our process, since we went into a lot of process and protocol, that it's useful when we don't have a unanimous vote because it gives somebody else reading this after the fact, reason to explore whatever. So I want to make sure we always have the opportunity to kind of communicate to our point, but I don't want to convince you for.
No, I mean, I think we had a good conversation. And frankly, the whole conversation I thought was good, like raising the questions and hearing, from ACPD about the body worn camera policy and everything from numbers of officers there and requests for supervisors. So anyway,
Okay.
I'm prepared to vote.
If we think we're unanimous, then we can probably vote all at once. Exonerated on all officers exonerated on all counts except not sustained for officers 1, 2, 4, 5, and the supervising officer on duty responsibilities. Do I hear a motion to adopt the investigative lead recommendations?
Also move.
Second. All in favor, aye? Aye. Gary, do you want to vote? His
I think you're on
phone
mute
was,
still.
yeah, Yeah, his phone's also dropping out earlier.
Yes, sorry about that. I do concur with,
The recommendation.
yes, I do.
Excellent. Thank you. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Wonderful. Okay. We might have a member of the public online, so we do have a brief opportunity for public comment. If there are any, we didn't have any requests. And then any open discussion. I think we'll have more significant kind of procedural and planning updates at the next meeting. We are going to plan to do 2 investigations, just get us caught up, and then hopefully we'll be able to not meet June 26th, which I think would make everyone happy. But in the interim, let me know if anyone has in-person scheduling constraints on the 12th, because we're operating on thin margins. So.
Do you want these back?
I do, thank you. And that's all. We'll declare the meeting adjourned until right after we see what Gary's typing.
Gary typing?
Pending digital press.
No, hey, thanks, guys, and great meeting, great discussion by everybody. Lisa's point about, hey, we, never want to second guess officers, but the point of we don't want to see our county police, doing things, and say in response to, asking for a supervisor. And I know the way people can ask sometimes can be very, like they're trying to take control of the situation. It's the same reason that I brought up earlier, the, requesting the name. Sometimes that can be said in a way that's very, trying to, take control of the situation. But those things by themselves, I totally agree with her. Whether it's either of those things, I just think that's something we need to be sensitive to. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary, and thanks for joining us virtually. We'll look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks.
2 weeks.
Okay.
Okay. All right. See you later.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.